Phillips, get out of my way. I'm a historian. Here because we know that Charles Bulfinch is buried here, but we're also going to see if any of his business partners are here, which would be Joseph Burrell, Crowell Hatch, Samuel Brown, and John Derby. So the graves of the Derby family here. Born November 29th, 17 blankety blank. Married to John Derby, October 3rd, 1787, which would have been just a couple days after the Columbia left Boston Harbor. It was a wedding present.
Although he came from Salem, John Derby would have been courting Elizabeth Cheevers Pierce in Boston when Charles Bulfinch and Joseph Burrell were putting together a syndicate for global trade in early 1787. It was a natural choice to tap John Derby.
John Derby was actually very fortunate as a young man. He was born into one of the wealthiest families in Salem. So John was probably sailing for the first time by the time he was 12 or 13. His older brother, Richard Derby Jr., was a member of the committee that was dealing with the aftermath of the battles at Lexington and Concord. And so they decided they really need to get the news over to England, to the American agents. Fortunately, Richard Derby Jr. said, oh, I happen to have a little schooner, and I happen to know a captain who is reliable, and someone who can keep the secrets and won't be bribed. And that would have been John Derby.
Little brother.
So, little brother. And it's this wonderful cloak and dagger midnight ride, getting into London and delivering the news to the American agents. And this was a huge propaganda coup. There actually was a pretty vocal support for the American cause in the English Parliament.
Right. The party in power was the one calling the shots and being very heavy-handed with the American colonies, and the minority party,
the Whig Party, yes.
Right, exactly,
yeah.
Was the one that was that they would want to go talk to, and yes. The American delegation was led by
Benjamin Franklin.
And then during the war itself, he is a privateer captain.
He was a privateer captain, yes. There's a common misconception that privateering is piracy or legalized piracy. You often hear that. It's absolutely not true. Privateering is not piracy.
Don't hold back.
It's something I feel very strongly about, because for these guys in the 18th century, an accusation of piracy was tantamount to being called a traitor at that time, a thief, a murderer. A privateer is operating under legal authority of some government. The Massachusetts government first, and then later the Continental Congress were issuing privateer licenses.
John Kendrick, in fact, was granted a license, so he was doing the same sort of thing.
Yeah, and I would be willing to bet that most of the folks involved in the Columbia expedition who had been active during the Revolution either owned a privateer, invested in a privateer, or was a captain or mate for a privateer. The idea with having privateers is that you're cutting the supply lines of the country with which you are at war.
But it is still naval warfare for profit.
It is, but if you're on a naval vessel and you capture a mercantile vessel of the country with which you are at war, you would also get a prize money.
Everybody had a personal motivation
Absolutely.
Because they're going to share in whatever they capture. Of course, these days, if the U.S. Navy went out and captured a vessel and all of the sailors got a split of whatever the oil tanker was or something like that, people would say, wait a minute,
yes.
that's a pirate right there. That's what you would think, in the present day, because we've kind of moved so far beyond that. So the Derbys were kind of like Halliburton?
In some ways, yes. They're the same government contractor, type of government contractor that we see today.
Right.
And that's because that's why in many ways war is so profitable for the economy, because it's pushing cash into the economy. He's one of these guys who manages to be in the right place at the right time. He was in France in the Astria in 1783 when the Treaty of Paris is signed.
That's the peace treaty that ended the war between Great Britain and the United States.
Correct. And he is the first to bring the news of the signing of the Treaty of Paris to the United States.
So he bookends the revolution quite neatly.
He really does bookend the revolution quite neatly. His second oldest brother, Elias Haskett, was the one who was putting a lot of money into privateering.
Right.
So by the end of the war, he's able to be building massive ships, including the Grand Turk. The Grand Turk is a bit of a burden, actually, after the war is over, because it's a great size to go out and actually capture large vessels. But in terms of the West Indies trade that was so profitable for us before the American Revolution, it's too big. And so Haskett very early has his eye on international trade. And so he actually sends the Grand Turk to the East Indies. That really opens the China trade.
But this shows that there's a way to be able to go directly to China. And so that sparks the idea, perhaps, and his involvement in the Columbia expedition, and to be included by Joseph Burrell and Charles Bulfinch.
For John, probably this was a safe alternative rather than trying to initiate his own voyages out to the East Indies. There may have been a little bit of an issue of being in his brother's shadow, and so he's saying, okay, my brother's he's leading our trade to Russia, he's leading our trade to China and Asia. Let me see what I can do. And so the Columbia expedition is probably his way of saying, okay, I can get involved with international trade. He's
definitely taking a different way than his brother has done, and striking out kind of on his own. And there was there's developed a rivalry between Salem and Boston. Yes,
and the indications are that John seemed to have been pretty heavily connected down in Boston. His second wife, Elizabeth Cheevers Pierce, is actually from Boston.
Right, and he marries her just a couple days after the Columbia leaves on its voyage.
So for Joseph Burrell, John Derby seemed a natural as a business partner in the Columbia expedition. With his family's experience in the China trade as a privateer, he was used to taking risks and seeing a fabulous return for it. Another man that came on board would have had that same experience in taking on risk as a privateer and have made a lot of money during the Revolution, but in the slave trade, involving risk and brutality. Captain Crowell Hatch of Cambridge.
Yeah, I'm the king of the world coming down.